Okay, settle in. Let me tell you about something that happened out here. Something that chipped away a piece of the comfort I used to feel in these woods. You gotta understand, I'm not some weekend hiker who gets spooked by a snapping twig. My name's Mark, and for the better part of 15 years, I've worked for the Forest Service up here in the Pacific Northwest. Mostly Washington, sometimes Oregon. My backyard is millions of acres of Douglas fir, western hemlock, Sitka spruce, deep ravines choked with ferns, and mountains that scrape the clouds. I know these woods. I mean, know them. The way the light filters through the canopy at different times of day. The smell of damp earth and pine needles. The specific crunch of boots on dry summer duff versus the soggy squelch of the rainy season. And I know the animals, especially the bears. We've got black bears mostly. A few grizzlies wander down from further north or east sometimes, but they're rare in my usual sectors. Black bears, though, they're part of the landscape. I've seen dozens, maybe hundreds. Startled them foraging for berries. Watched them amble across logging roads. Dealt with the occasional troublemaker getting too friendly with campgrounds, or once trying to peel open a poorly secured supply shed like a tin can. You learn their habits, their bluff charges, scary as hell the first time, but mostly just noise and show. The way they move, that distinctive rolling gait, surprisingly quiet for their size when they want to be. The signs they leave, scat full of berries and fur. Claw marks on trees marking territory. The specific way they tear apart a rotten log looking for grubs. I carry bear spray, always. I make noise when I'm hiking in thick brush. I know the protocols. 99 times out of 100. A bear wants less to do with you than you want to do with it. They hear you, they smell you, they melt back into the trees. It's a rhythm, a dance you learn. Respect their space, don't surprise them, and things usually stay calm. That knowledge, that familiarity, it was like a shield. Until last fall. It was late September. The air was starting to get that crisp edge, the vine maples turning fiery red and orange in the understory. We had a dry couple of weeks, which was unusual, making the forest floor noisy underfoot. I was heading out to check on a series of remote weather sensors we'd installed deep in a less trafficked sector, maybe 10 miles off the nearest gravel service road. It's the kind of task that takes a full day. Hike in, check the equipment, calibrate, clean off any debris, check battery levels, hike out. Solitude, just the way I liked it most days. The hike in was beautiful. Sun filtering through the ancient cedars, the air cool enough to need a fleece jacket, but warming up as I moved. The usual chatter of squirrels, the distant call of a Steller's jay. Standard stuff. I reached the first sensor around mid-morning, nestled in a small clearing. Everything looked good. Cleaned the solar panel, checked the connections, made notes in my log. Standard. I packed up and started heading towards the second sensor site, about 2 miles further west, deeper into older growth. The terrain got a bit rougher here, the trail less defined, more blowdowns to clamber over. This was proper wilderness, the kind where you might not see another human track for weeks. I was maybe halfway to the second site, navigating a thicker patch of devil's club and salmonberry bushes, when I heard it. Crack, snap, loud, close, like something heavy stepping squarely on a thick, dry branch. Instinct kicked in immediately. Bear. I stopped dead. Listened. Silence for a moment. Then another sound. A heavy shuffle thump, like something bulky pushing through dense foliage, followed by another splintering crack. It sounded maybe 50, 60 yards off to my right, uphill from me. The wind was blowing gently from my left towards the sound, meaning whatever it was likely hadn't scented me yet. Good. "Hey, bear," I called out, my voice firm and loud, projecting. "Hey, whoop whoop." Standard procedure. Let it know you're human. Let it know you're there. Usually that's enough. You might hear a retreating rustle or nothing at all as it silently slips away. But the noise didn't stop. It paused for a beat after my call, then continued. Shuff, crack, thump, shuff, snap. It sounded deliberate and heavy, really heavy. Heavier than your average black bear, maybe. My mind flashed to grizzlies, but we were pretty far west for them. Still possible. A big male black bear could push 400, maybe 500 pounds. They could make some noise when they weren't trying to be quiet. I unclipped the bear spray from my hip holster, thumb resting on the safety catch. Took a slow step back, scanning the dense wall of green uphill. More noise. A series of heavy impacts, almost rhythmic. Thump, crunch. Thump, crunch. It wasn't the sound of foraging. It wasn't the sound of something digging or tearing at a log. It sounded like walking, but wrong. A bear walks on 4 legs. There's a cadence to it, a rolling motion. This sounded more like impacts, heavy impacts of heavy motion, distinct footfalls. Thump, thump, and the breaking branches weren't just the occasional snap of underbrush. These were loud cracks, like limbs thicker than my arm were being casually broken and pushed aside. My internal alarm bells, usually calibrated for bear behavior, started ringing with a different frequency. This wasn't matching the patterns I knew. Could it be a moose? We have them, but they're gangly, often noisy in a crashing, clumsy way. This felt more powerful, controlled even. And moose usually stay closer to marshy areas or lakes, not typically this deep in the dense, older forest. "Hey, get out of here!" I yelled again, louder this time, trying to inject more authority, less nervousness than I was starting to feel. The response was chilling. The heavy sounds stopped. Absolute silence from that direction for maybe 10 long seconds. The forest held its breath. Even the squirrels seemed to quiet down. Then, a new sound started. A low, guttural huffing, not the warning woof of a bear, not the grunt of a moose. It was deep, resonant, and it vibrated in the air, felt almost as much as heard. It was followed by another crack, louder than before, like something substantial had just been snapped in half effortlessly. And it was closer now, definitely closer, maybe 40 yards. My hand tightened on the bear spray. The familiarity of the woods was evaporating, replaced by a prickling sense of wrongness. The shield of experience felt suddenly thin. My brain was scrambling, trying to fit the sounds into a known category. Big bear, angry bear, injured bear. Nothing quite fit the sheer power implied by those sounds, or that weird, rhythmic movement. Then the smell hit me. It wasn't the musky, slightly rank odor of a wet bear. It wasn't the earthy smell of overturned soil or decaying wood. This was different, acrid, almost metallic, like old blood, but mixed with something else. Something pungent and sour, like ammonia or old, stale sweat left to fester. It came and went on the breeze, faint but undeniable and deeply unpleasant. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Bears can smell, sure, but this wasn't bear smell. My heart was hammering against my ribs now. "Okay, Mark," I told myself. "Stay calm. Assess. You can't see it. It might just be passing through. Don't panic." But the sounds started again, moving parallel to me now, still uphill, but drawing slightly ahead. Thump, crunch. Thump, crunch. The rhythm was undeniable. 2 beats, bipedal. No, that couldn't be right. My mind recoiled from the implication. A person out here, moving like that, breaking branches that size, smelling like that? Impossible. Utterly impossible. And yet, thump, crunch. Thump, crunch. I had to see. Curiosity wrestled with a rapidly growing terror. I needed to put eyes on whatever this was, to categorize it, to make it make sense, edging slowly behind the thick trunk of an ancient cedar. I peered through a gap in the dense salal bushes covering the forest floor uphill. The foliage was thick, shadows deep, even in the middle of the day. I scanned the area where the sounds were coming from, maybe 30 yards away now. Movement. A flicker of something dark against the green. Not the glossy black of a bear's fur. This was duller, matted, and tall. I caught a glimpse of something moving between two thick fir trees, something upright, massively broad at the shoulder level. It was obscured almost instantly, but the impression was staggering. It was huge, taller than a man, significantly broader, and it moved with a slow, deliberate power that was utterly unlike any animal I'd ever witnessed. It wasn't the fluid grace of a cougar, nor the rolling power of a bear. It was ponderous, yet immensely strong. Just as I registered the impossible size, it stopped again. The huffing sound returned, louder this time, closer, and then something that turned my blood to ice. A low click, not a twig snapping, a sharp, almost mechanical sounding click-clack, followed by another. It didn't sound organic. That was it. My brain stopped trying to rationalize. The carefully constructed walls of logic and experience crumbled. Every instinct screamed, danger, unknown, flee. I didn't think. I reacted. I spun around, abandoning any pretense of stealth or protocol. My expensive sensor equipment, my carefully packed lunch, my years of training, none of it mattered. I just ran, scrambling, stumbling down the slope, away from the sounds, away from the smell. Away from that impossible glimpse of something wrong. Branches whipped at my face, roots snagged at my boots. I half fell, caught myself on a tree trunk, skinning my palms, scrambled back up without pausing. Adrenaline surged through me, cold and electric. Behind me, I heard it. Crack! A sound like a gunshot, echoing through the trees. Another thick branch broken. Then, the heavy footfalls again. Thump, crunch, thump, crunch. Faster now, unmistakably following me. Oh God. It was following me. I pushed harder, lungs burning, legs pumping like pistons. The forest floor was a blur of greens and browns. I wasn't on the trail anymore, just crashing through the underbrush in a blind panic, heading generally downhill, towards the direction of the service road, miles away. Was it still behind me? I couldn't tell over the pounding of my own heart and the gasping breaths tearing from my throat. I risked a glance over my shoulder, saw nothing but the dense, indifferent trees. But I felt it, a primal certainty of pursuit, a pressure on my back that wasn't just the weight of my pack. I ran until my lungs felt like they were coated in sandpaper, until my legs were trembling uncontrollably. I burst out of the thicker woods onto a slightly more open ridge, covered in huckleberry bushes. I didn't stop. I kept pushing, fueled by pure terror, until I finally stumbled onto a familiar, albeit faint, game trail that I knew eventually led back towards the main path. Only then did I allow myself to slow, collapsing behind a large fallen log. Gasping for air, bear spray still clutched in my white-knuckled fist. I listened, straining my ears. Nothing. Just the wind whispering through the treetops, the distant chatter of a squirrel resuming its territorial dispute. The heavy footfalls, the branch snapping, the huffing, the clicks, all gone. Silence. But it wasn't the peaceful silence of before. This silence felt heavy, watchful. I stayed hunched behind that log for what felt like an eternity, trembling, sweat cooling rapidly on my skin, making me shiver despite the exertion. My mind raced, replaying the sounds, the smell, that fleeting, terrifying glimpse. It wasn't a bear. The certainty was absolute now, chilling me to the bone. But if not a bear, then what? What moves on two legs, is built like a tank, snaps trees like twigs, smells like death, and makes clicking sounds in the deep woods? The logical part of my brain, the part trained by years of forestry work and wildlife biology courses, had no answer. It felt like a circuit breaker had tripped. The woods, my sanctuary, my place of expertise, suddenly felt alien and menacing. Eventually, the adrenaline subsided, leaving me shaky and exhausted. I cautiously got to my feet, scanning the trees around me, every shadow looking like a potential threat. I forced myself to move, sticking to the game trail, or moving as quickly and quietly as I could. The remaining miles back to the service road were the longest of my life. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a distant twig sent jolts of fear through me. I didn't make any calls, didn't try to act tough. I just focused on putting one foot in front of the other, getting out. When I finally saw the glint of my Forest Service truck through the trees, parked alone at the rudimentary trailhead, a wave of relief so intense washed over me that my knees nearly buckled. I fumbled with the keys, hands still shaking, threw my pack onto the passenger seat, and locked the doors the second I was inside. I sat there for a long moment, engine off, just breathing, staring into the dense tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing looked out of place. Had I imagined the intensity of it? Had fear magnified a strange encounter with an unusually aggressive bear into something monstrous? No. The smell, the sounds, the size. It was real. I drove back to the station, the gravel road blurring beneath my tires. I didn't report it. How could I? Oh, yeah, dispatch. Mark here. Ran into something big out by Sector 7. Wasn't a bear. Sounded like it was walking on two legs, snapping trees. Smelled awful. Might have clicked at me. No, I didn't get a clear look. They'd think I was drunk or crazy or both. Send me for psych evaluation. Ground me at a desk. I tried to rationalize it later that night, alone in my small cabin. A half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table. Maybe it was a person, some hermit gone feral. But the size, the strength required to break those branches, and the smell. No, it didn't fit. Maybe some undocumented primate? The Bigfoot legends are thick as fog up here, whispered around campfires, usually laughed off. I'd always laughed them off. Until now. Now, the idea didn't seem quite so funny. It seemed terrifying. I went back a week later. Not alone. Took another ranger, Dave, with me, under the pretext of checking the sensor I'd forgotten to log properly. I didn't tell him the real reason. As we got closer to the area, I felt that prickling unease return. The woods felt different. Heavy. Quiet. We found the area where I first heard the noises. And the evidence was there. Several thick limbs, easily 4 or 5 inches in diameter, were snapped clean off trees. Higher than a bear could comfortably reach, and broken with immense force, not chewed or clawed. There were huge, indistinct depressions in the softer ground near a small seep, vaguely oval, much larger than my size 11 boot, and spaced unnaturally far apart for any animal I knew. The stride was enormous. Dave noticed the broken branches. "Damn," he muttered. "Windstorm must have hit hard through here." "Yeah," I said, my voice tight. "Must have." I didn't smell it that day. Didn't hear anything out of the ordinary. But the feeling lingered. The sensor was fine, of course. We hiked out. Dave chatting about football. Me, lost in my thoughts, scanning the trees. The feeling of being watched, clinging to me like the damp forest air. I still work out here. It's my job, my life. But something shifted that day. The woods don't feel like home in the same way. When I'm deep in, miles from any road, that familiar comfort is gone. Replaced by a constant, low-level hum of anxiety. I listen more intently than I used to. I study tracks with a new, unwelcome curiosity. I avoid that sector whenever possible. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind howls outside my cabin, I hear a distant branch snap, and my blood runs cold all over again. Because I know, with a certainty that settles deep in my bones, what I heard and what I almost saw out there. And it wasn't a bear. All right, pull up a chair. Let me tell you about a trip that was supposed to be the highlight of our year. Maybe even our young adult lives. turned out to be the day the music died, replaced by something much, much uglier. It was a few years back. We were young, you know? Early 20s, feeling indestructible, just starting to figure things out after college. There were 5 of us. Me, Rachel, I was 23 then, Rob, Jenna, Jay, and Dave. We weren't just friends, we were that group. The kind forged in the fires of awkward high school dances, late night study sessions fueled by cheap pizza, shared secrets, and unbreakable loyalty. We'd weathered teenage drama, celebrated each other's small victories, and navigated those first shaky steps into adulthood together. The bond was solid, like family we'd chosen. Or what felt like forever, probably closer to a year, realistically. We'd been planning this camping trip. The idea was simple. Escape the concrete jungle, the deadlines, the screens, the constant noise of city life. We craved towering trees, clean air, the crackle of a campfire, and the kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think. We pored over maps, debated gear lists, dreamt of campfire meals that always taste better outdoors. The anticipation built steadily. A bright spot on the horizon. For me, especially, stuck in a soul-crushing entry-level job, this trip felt like a lifeline, a promise of freedom and genuine connection. Man, I couldn't have been more wrong. The day finally arrived, crisp and clear in late summer. We loaded up Jay's beat-up SUV, packs practically bursting with tents, sleeping bags, food, and maybe a little too much cheap beer. Our spirits were soaring as high as the eagles we hoped to spot. We drove for a couple of hours, windows down, bad music blasting, the cityscape shrinking in the rearview mirror, replaced by rolling hills, and then the dense green embrace of the national forest. We parked at the designated trailhead, the air immediately smelling cleaner, sharper. Our packs felt heavy settling onto our shoulders, pulling us down with the weight of readiness. But it was a good weight. A weight that promised adventure. We set off, boots crunching on the gravel path that soon turned to dirt. The trail was exactly what we'd hoped for. It wound through groves of massive pines and firs, sunlight dappling through the thick canopy. It climbed gently at first, then dipped into cool, mossy ravines where small streams trickled over smooth stones, only to rise again onto sunnier ridges. We were buzzing, laughing at stupid inside jokes, pointing out interesting plants or animal tracks. Rob, ever the clown, kept trying to scare Jenna, who'd jump and then punch his arm playfully. Jay, quieter but always observant, identified birds by their calls. Dave was just soaking it all in, a wide grin plastered on his face. It felt good, truly, deeply good, like shedding a heavy skin of stress and obligation. Just us, the woods, and the simple promise of a night under the stars. By late afternoon, we'd covered a decent chunk of ground, maybe 5 or 6 miles. We weren't aiming for a specific campsite yet, planning to hike another hour or two before setting up. We came across this perfect little clearing, tucked away just off the trail, nestled beneath a low, rocky rise. It felt sheltered, almost cozy, like a natural pause button in the middle of the wilderness. "Break time?" Rob suggested, already shrugging off his pack. No arguments there. We gratefully dropped our loads, the sudden lightness almost making us dizzy. We sprawled out on the soft bed of pine needles, pulling out squashed sandwiches and water bottles. Aside from the gentle rustle of leaves overhead and the occasional distant bird call, the forest was profoundly quiet. It was that deep, resonant silence that sinks into your bones, making you feel both incredibly small and intimately connected to everything around you. It felt special, sacred almost, a moment of pure peace. Looking back, that peace feels like a cool joke. We were probably there for 15, maybe 20 minutes, relaxing, stretching out sore muscles, planning the last leg of the day's hike. Dave finished his sandwich first, brushed the crumbs off his jeans, and stood up. "Nature calls," he announced casually, gesturing vaguely towards a thicker stand of trees at the edge of the clearing. "Be right back." We barely acknowledged him. Jenna was reapplying sunscreen. Rob was trying to skip stones across a tiny puddle left from a recent rain. Jay and I were debating the merits of different instant coffee brands for the morning. Normalcy. Utter, mundane normalcy. Seconds ticked by. Maybe a minute. Maybe 2. Long enough for the casual nature of Dave's departure to fade slightly, but not long enough for any real concern to set in. He was just taking a leak, right? Then the sound came. It wasn't a yelp of surprise. It wasn't a cry of pain, like stubbing a toe or twisting an ankle. This was a scream ripped from the deepest, most primal part of a human being. Raw, guttural, filled with an agony and terror so profound it bypassed thought and plugged directly into pure panic. It sliced through the peaceful clearing like a chainsaw through silk. It echoed off the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But we knew instantly, chillingly, that it was Dave. We were on our feet before the scream even finished echoing, the remnants of our peaceful break forgotten. Sandwiches dropped, water bottles overturned. We plunged into the trees in the direction Dave had gone, adrenaline surging, hearts hammering against ribs. branches snagged at our clothes, whipped at our faces. "Dave!" Rob yelled, crashing through the undergrowth. "Dave, where are you?" We found him maybe 30 yards in, crumpled on the forest floor. He wasn't screaming anymore, just making these awful, choked, gasping sounds. His hands were clawing frantically at his lower leg and clamped around his ankle, almost invisible against the dirt and leaf litter until you were right on top of it, was an old bear trap. Its rusted metal jaws were snapped shut with brutal efficiency, biting deep into his flesh just above the boot line. Blood was already pooling beneath him, a dark, viscous stain spreading rapidly into the thirsty earth. His face was chalky white, slick with a cold sweat, his eyes wide with shock and unbearable pain as he writhed feebly. "Oh God! Oh God, Dave!" Jenna dropped to her knees beside him, her hands hovering uselessly, trembling so hard she looked like she might vibrate apart. She didn't know what to touch, what to do. Rob swore violently. A string of curses spat out between clenched teeth, pacing in a tight, agitated circle like a caged animal. Jay just stood frozen for a second, his face a mask of disbelief, staring at the trap, at the blood, at Dave's mangled leg. I forced myself to look closer, bile rising in my throat. The trap looked ancient, pitted with rust, its heavy chain leading to a thick metal stake driven deep into the ground. It must have been concealed just beneath the surface layer of leaves and dirt, abandoned years, maybe decades ago, a forgotten relic of a crueler time, just waiting for an unlucky step. Dave's step. Suddenly, Jay snapped out of his paralysis. He knelt beside Jenna, his voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the panic. Okay. I've seen these before. Hunting shows, documentaries, old traps like this. There's usually a release mechanism. We just need to find it. He started running his hands carefully along the trap's edges, fingers probing the rusted metal, oblivious to the blood smearing onto his skin. Dave had clamped his jaw shut, trying to stifle his whimpers, his breathing coming in short, sharp bursts. The sheer agony radiating off him was palpable. "Easy, Dave. Easy, buddy," Jay murmured, his own fingers trembling slightly now as he worked. "We'll get you out." It felt like an eternity, every second stretched taut with Dave's suffering and our frantic hope. Then Jay let out a small grunt of discovery. "Found it! Here, under the spring mechanism." He pointed to a rusted lever, half buried and almost fused with the main body of the trap. "Okay, listen. This is gonna hurt like hell when it releases. Rob, Rachel, hold him steady. Jenna, keep talking to him." Rob and I grabbed Dave's shoulders, pinning him down as gently but firmly as we could. He was still thrashing weakly, his body rigid with pain. Jenna gripped his hand, murmuring reassurances, though I doubt he could even hear her over the roaring in his ears. Jay positioned himself, took a deep breath, and pressed down hard on the lever with both hands, straining against the corroded metal. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, with a protesting groan of rusted steel, the lever moved. The trap jaws sprang apart with a vicious snap. Dave screamed again, a sharp, piercing cry as the sudden release of pressure sent fresh waves of agony through his mangled limb. He went limp almost immediately after, his head lolling to the side, consciousness finally deserting him. His leg was free, but the sight was horrific. I looked, then quickly wished I hadn't. The flesh was torn wide open, a ragged, gaping wound. Pieces of muscle and tendon were shredded. In the gruesome mess, I could clearly see the white gleam of bone. My stomach churned violently, and I had to turn away, gagging. We had to get him back to the clearing. Jay and I carefully maneuvered him, trying not to jostle the injured leg, supporting his dead weight between us. Back in the relative open, Jenna was already digging through her pack, pulling out the first aid kit. Her hands were steadier now, focused on the task. She started cleaning the wound as best she could with antiseptic wipes, then wrapping it tightly with gauze pads and bandages. They soaked through with blood almost instantly. It was then that Rob did something that shifted the atmosphere from tragic accident to something far more sinister. He rummaged in his own pack and pulled out a handgun, a compact semi-automatic. He checked the magazine, chambered a round with a practiced click-clack that sounded unnervingly loud in the sudden quiet. "What the hell, Rob?" Jay asked, staring at the weapon. "In case," Rob muttered, his eyes scanning the surrounding trees, his face grim. "Bears, whatever the hell else might be out here." He didn't elaborate. None of us had known he brought it. Looking back, maybe he'd had some premonition, some gut feeling we dismissed as paranoia. The camping trip was obviously over. Dave needed a hospital fast. We were maybe 6 miles in, less than a day's hike back to the car if we pushed it. We made the hard decision to leave most of our gear: tents, sleeping bags, food supplies, everything non-essential. Weight was critical now. We took water, the first aid kit, and Rob's pistol. Jay and I took point carrying Dave, his arms slung over our shoulders, his injured leg dangling uselessly. It was agonizingly slow work. Jenna walked alongside, constantly checking Dave's bandages, trying to keep pressure on the wound, her face tight with worry. Rob took the rear, pistol held low but ready, constantly scanning the woods behind and around us. The forest felt completely different now. The beauty was gone, replaced by a suffocating sense of menace. Every shadow seemed deeper. Every rustle of leaves sounded like a threat. The paradise we'd entered just hours before had transformed into a hostile labyrinth, and the speed of that transformation was dizzying, terrifying. We made decent progress at first, fueled by adrenaline and fear. Dave drifted in and out of consciousness, groaning softly, occasionally asking where we were. He was getting paler, his skin clammy. The bandages were completely saturated, leaving a gruesome trail of bright red drops on the dusty path behind us. We knew every step jostled his mangled leg, causing him immense pain, but we had no choice. Stop, and he might bleed out. Stop, and, well, stopping just didn't feel safe anymore. And then, just when we thought things couldn't possibly get any worse, they did. We were maybe halfway back to the car, navigating a slightly more open section of the trail that cut across a small ridge. Suddenly, a sharp crack split the air, unnaturally loud, echoing through the trees. Something whizzed past my head, so close I felt the air stir against my earlobe, and smacked into a tree trunk just ahead of us with a sickening thwack. It took a split second for my brain to register. That wasn't a branch breaking. That was a gunshot. Someone screamed. Maybe Jenna, maybe me. I don't remember. Instinct took over. We hit the dirt, dragging Dave down with us behind a large, fallen log that offered minimal cover. Another shot rang out, closer this time. Bark exploded from the log just above my head, showering us with splinters. "Get down! Stay down!" Rob yelled, already scrambling into a slightly better position behind the base of a thick fir tree. He raised his pistol and fired back blindly in the general direction the shots had come from. Somewhere uphill, off the trail. Pop, pop, pop. The sound of his smaller caliber handgun seemed pitifully inadequate compared to the heavy crack of the rifle that was firing at us. "Go! Run! Get Dave to the car!" Rob shouted, waving us frantically onward while keeping his eyes fixed on the trees. "I'll cover you!" Jay and I didn't hesitate. We hauled Dave back to his feet. He was barely conscious, but some primal survival instinct, maybe pure adrenaline, kicked in. He was hopping frantically on his good leg, using us more for balance than support. Jenna stayed right with us, urging us on, her eyes wide with terror. Rob kept firing sporadically, shouting threats into the woods. "Get back! Leave us alone!" He was trying to draw fire, trying to give us a chance. He was incredibly brave, but I'll never forget the look on his face as he peeked out from behind the tree, firing. Wide-eyed, pale, utterly terrified. The woods erupted into chaos. Shots seemed to come from multiple directions now. Or maybe it was just the echoes playing tricks on us, bouncing off the trees, making it impossible to pinpoint the shooter's location. We ran blindly, stumbling down the trail, branches whipping our faces, lungs burning, tripping over roots. Dave despite the blood loss and horrific injury, was moving like a man possessed, hopping, stumbling, driven by sheer terror. Rob caught up to us, breathing heavily, fumbling to reload his pistol with shaking hands. "Keep going! Don't stop!" he gasped. The trees began to thin slightly. Through a gap, I caught a heart-stopping glimpse of something metallic, reflecting sunlight. Jay's SUV, the trailhead. We were close, so agonizingly close. Then, one final deafening crack echoed from behind us, followed by silence. A heavy, absolute silence that was almost worse than the gunfire. We didn't stop to check. We didn't look back. Fear pounded overrides on everything else. We burst out of the tree line and practically fell into the car. Jay and I wrestled Dave into the back seat, his blood smearing instantly across the upholstery. Jenna scrambled in beside him, pressing fresh bandages onto his leg, talking to him, trying to keep him conscious. Jay jumped into the driver's seat, fumbling with the keys. Rob kept his pistol aimed at the tree line, scanning frantically, until I slammed the passenger door shut. The engine roared to life. Jay slammed the gear shift into reverse, spun the wheel, and peeled out of the clearing, tires spitting gravel. We fishtailed onto the narrow service road, leaving the silent, menacing woods behind us. Dave was still alive, groaning in the back, but barely. His breathing was shallow. Jenna kept pressure on the wound, her knuckles white. Cell signal was non-existent out here, of course. The nearest town with a hospital was 30 miles away, down winding mountain roads. Down winding mountain roads. That drive was a blur of adrenaline and terror. We kept talking to Dave, shouting his name, asking him questions, anything to keep him tethered to consciousness. He'd respond sometimes with a moan or a slurred word. Every second felt like an eternity. A little voice in the back of my head kept whispering that he wasn't going to make it, that we were driving a dying man, and I had to actively fight to silence it. Rob kept looking back, his face grim, pistol still resting on his lap. Jay drove like a maniac, taking curves way too fast, his eyes fixed rigidly on the road ahead. We reached the small town just after nightfall, screeching to a halt outside the brightly lit emergency room entrance. We practically carried Dave inside, shouting for help. Doctors and nurses swarmed around us immediately, the scene dissolving into a controlled chaos of medical efficiency. They whisked Dave away on a stretcher, disappearing through swinging doors, leaving the four of us standing there, blinking in the harsh fluorescent lights. We collapsed onto the hard plastic chairs in the waiting room, utterly spent. We were covered in dirt, sweat, and Dave's blood. Our clothes were torn. We were shaking, reeling from the shock, the adrenaline crash hitting hard. Hours seemed to pass in a numb haze. Finally, a doctor came out. She looked exhausted but reassuring. Dave wasn't going to die. He'd lost a lot of blood, and his leg was, in her words, a complete mess. He needed immediate surgery, probably more than one down the line. There was a significant chance he might never walk the same way again, might always have a limp, nerve damage, but he was alive. We clung to that. He was alive. The police came next. 2 uniformed officers, looking tired and skeptical. We gave our statements, recounting everything from the idyllic start of the hike to the horrific discovery of the trap, the frantic efforts to free Dave, and then the sudden, inexplicable gunfire. They listened patiently, took notes, their expressions unreadable. "Did you see the shooter?" one of them asked. We all shook our heads. Nothing. Not a face, not clothing, not even a clear sense of where they were. Just the sound of the rifle, the impact of the bullets, and overwhelming terror. Had you encountered anyone else on the trail? Any arguments? Any strange interactions? No. We'd been completely alone. It wasn't like we'd pissed someone off. Someone had just started shooting at us, out of nowhere, for no reason we could fathom. The cops promised to investigate, to sweep the woods for shell casings, maybe check hunting records, look for reports of suspicious individuals. But their tone lacked conviction. It felt like they were going through the motions. We were just a bunch of city kids who'd stumbled into something bad in their woods. Another weird incident in a vast, uncontrollable wilderness. Dave's parents arrived, frantic, and took over dealing with the hospital and the police. They called the station repeatedly for updates in the following weeks, but the investigation quickly stalled. No witnesses, no suspects, no motive. The shooter vanished back into the forest as silently and mysteriously as they'd emerged. The case went cold, filed away under unsolved. The identity of the person who tried to kill us remains a mystery to this day. We never went back to those woods. Obviously, the gear we abandoned stayed there, slowly being reclaimed by the forest, a silent monument to the day our adventure turned into a living nightmare. Dave recovered, eventually, after multiple surgeries and months of grueling physical therapy. He walks again. He has a noticeable limp, a network of nasty scars hidden under his jeans, and constant pain he rarely complains about. But he walks. You'd never guess, looking at him casually, that he'd almost lost his leg, almost lost his life, because of a rusted piece of metal and a stranger with a rifle. We're all still close, The five of us, maybe even closer, bound by that shared trauma. We tried talking about it a couple of times late at night. Usually after a few drinks had loosened our tongues. But the words always felt inadequate. The questions just hung there, heavy and unanswerable. Who set that ancient trap? Was it placed recently, or had it waited there for decades? And who fired those shots? Were they connected to the trap? Was it the same person? Or just horrifyingly bad luck, stumbling from one danger into another? Was it a hunter mistaking us for game? A poacher protecting their territory? Or something worse? Someone deliberately targeting us for reasons we'll never comprehend? Speculating felt pointless, agonizing even. We learned to live with the not knowing. None of us hike much anymore, especially not deep in the woods. The trees don't feel inviting. The silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels watchful, loaded. Sometimes, when I hear a car backfire or a sharp noise in the quiet, I flinch. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear Dave's scream echoing in the back of my mind, followed by the crack of that rifle. We survived. Physically, mostly. But something broke in all of us that day, out there in the beautiful, terrible woods. Something that, unlike Dave's leg, will never fully heal. And I know, without having to ask, that every single one of them feels exactly the same way. The woods started shooting back, and we'll carry the ricochet forever. Point.